So, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure today to host Daniel Chernilo. Daniel has been a long colleague of mine and obviously of other colleagues at Loughborough University. And I'm not sure how many years ago, Daniel, did you move to Chile?
In 2017, I came back to Chile.
So, 4 years ago, Daniel moved to the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, where he's a professor of sociology there. He's also the director of a doctoral program. Daniel is a very accomplished, I don't have to say, he's a very accomplished scholar, and his field is mainly in the social and political thought, and he has engaged extensively also with the philosophical dimension of sociology. And for the purpose of today, because also this is a LUNN talk, so the Loughborough University Nationalism Network, Daniel has kindly offered to present a paper which has been recently published in Sociology, in the journal Sociology, as part of a special issues on nationalism futures. Daniel, for the people that are familiar with nationalism studies, is well known for his contribution on methodological nationalism. And today he will go back 10 years after exactly also to methodological nationalism, although not only. He will talk for about 30-35 minutes, and then as usual, there will be time for comments and questions at the end. So I will leave the virtual floor to Daniel and close the camera as well. Thank you, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for coming, and indeed to Marco for the invitation. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking to present in front of colleagues, and also because when you don't speak the language for a few years, you feel that the language abandons you. And I feel that my English is not. It was never very good, but it is as bad as it's ever been. So I do feel slightly more nervous than usual, but we'll see how it goes. The talk for today has the same title as the paper that, as Marco said, was published last year. And if you put the next slide, Marco, please. I'll tell you a little bit about the background of what I want to say today.
Yeah, sorry, Daniel. Trying to the technology always leaves us. I think it's more complicated than expected.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
1 second, sorry.
For some reason, I cannot share my own PowerPoint, so Marco kindly agreed to do it, but now it's playing up with us.
You should see them.
That's a slide I want, yes. Second one, yeah.
Yeah,
I can see it. I'm not sure it's in full screen mode, but I can see it.
If you can see them, it's fine. That means everybody can see it.
Okay. So the background for today's talk, it's really, and this is a little bit of a joke, but it's not really a joke. It's really Marco's fault, in the sense that for the nearly 8 years I was at Loughborough, on the one hand, I was always teaching on nationalism, and I think I got my job at Loughborough in 2009 because of my work on nationalism, and yet I never wrote on nationalism while I was at Loughborough. But Marco was always saying, oh, we should do something on nationalism, you should write on nationalism, but I never did while at Loughborough. So then the opportunity came up because the journal Sociology was putting a special issue together on the future of nationalism, and of nationalism studies. So it was an opportunity for me to kind of come back to some of the earlier work I've done on nationalism. My PhD, nearly over 15 years ago, was on the question of methodological nationalism. I put some of the early publications there. A book came out of my PhD. So I was able, in this more recent paper, kind of bring together some of that earlier work on methodological nationalism, but also to connect that particular body of work with some other areas of nationalism studies with which I not really engage in a more kind of systematic way. So the paper, and indeed the talk, it's a little bit of a kind of state-of-the-art kind of argument. Of course, I will be presenting some kind of bolder claims, but in a way I was trying to say, okay, what is the literature telling us about the state of the field in nationalism studies in at least 3 areas? So the background of the talk, as I say, is the kind of a little bit of a personal trajectory, insofar as I'm trying to look at what's happened to nationalism studies in the past 10, 15 years. And on the other hand, there was this kind of external trigger, as it were, because sociology was publishing this special issue. The next slide, please, Marco. So what I want to do today, I'll go in 5 steps. I want to offer a kind of a starting point, and I want to claim that we still don't really know what nations are. So after 150 years of scholarship, or 100 years of scholarship on nationalism, I would say we're not really back to square one, but there is a certain opacity, there is a certain strangeness of nationalism that remains with us. And then the 3 more substantive sections of the paper are the 3 substantive versions of the talk today. I will revisit the problem of methodological nationalism. I will look at questions of modernism and primordialism, which are the 2 main approaches to the study of nationalism in nationalism studies. And then I'll say a few things about the politics of nationalism, and I'll close with, of course, some brief closing remarks. So that's the plan for today. Excellent. So I start here with Weber, and Weber, when he wrote about the nation, it's very interesting because he didn't write a lot about the nation, but he wrote very meaningfully about the nation. And most of what he said about the nation is that we're not quite sure what a nation is. Now, I've selected a few quotations there. He says it's one of the most vexing concepts in sociology. He says nations do not have an economic origins. They are not identical with the people of a state. They are not identical with a community that speaks the same language. They are not a cultural community, common anthropological type, so are not sufficient to found a nation, so nations are not races in the language of the time. No common blood, ethnic solidarity is not enough. So when Weber is talking about the nation, he, as I said, there are 10 or 15 pages of his huge body of work devoted to the nation. And the only positive definition he's able to say, well, is this relatively vague political sense of belonging in relation to other groups. He's unable to go beyond this sense that, well, we feel that belong together in some political sense when we relate to other groups. But in any other capacity, all the other candidates, as it were, that have been used, and this is 1910, yes, so over 100 years ago, well before the establishment of nationalism studies, all the other candidates for the definition of the nation are wanting. He found them all problematic: language, religion, race, culture. He even has a go at some of his colleagues. He said, well, the different types of beer. Tom may want to dig up the quotation. Well, different nations may have their own beers, and that may be what defines a nation. And he says, of course, it doesn't work. Nothing really seems to work to define what really a nation is. The nation is one of those empty signifiers, some may want to say in a more kind of contemporary language. And I think there is something to it. And I think there is something, someone may want to say rather neurotic or we may want to say rather obsessive with the kind of scientific precision that we need to be able to say what a nation is. And my approach to the problem of nations and nationalism is to let that opacity, that rather strangeness of the nation, to unfold. And we kind of have to learn how to deal with it. We have to learn to live with it. Not to the conclusions as yet, Marco. So yeah, to number 5, please. So this is my starting point. The idea that I'm not after a kind of a bulletproof kind of scientific definition of the nation. And one way in which the literature has tried to achieve that, you know, watertight definition of the nation is what we call the debate on methodological nationalism. And methodological nationalism is defined, and this was put forward first in the 1970s by the Portuguese sociologist called Hermínio Martins, as the idea that the nation state is the natural, the necessary, indeed the optimal form of society in modernity. As societies progress, as societies modernize, they will take the form of nation states. So as processes of decolonization in Southeast Asia and in Africa not take place, these pre-modern societies will develop in such a way that will be, they will become more like modern nation states. And there are various presuppositions behind this rather problematic or highly problematic claim. The first of which is that nation state then develop endogenously from the inside out, that nation state have to be self-sufficient, they have to be self-reliant, they have to be able to provide for themselves in every area of society. Developmental policies in the third world in the 1950s and 60s were thinking in those terms. They have to be self-sufficient in terms of natural resources, in terms of all the technological and professional skills that they need. And if we develop in this fashion, then the modern world will constitute itself as a system of nation states where every single nation state will be formally equivalent to any other. So Brazil and Singapore, because both are nation states, will be formally the same. So no wonder this is a highly problematic view. So by the 1980s and early 1990s, not only, but mostly with the rise of globalization theories, well, this looked rather problematic. So, and this is the period where Giddens started talking about globalization, Manuel Castells started talking about the rise of the network society. Mick Billig was talking about this in his talk last week or the week before. Ulrich Beck started talking about risk and global risks or world risk society. And it's interesting because for all of them, there was this kind of zero-sum game that the more globalization develops, the less nation states in this fashion we would have. So globalization, in a sense, had to mean the end of modernity because it meant the weakening of nation states. And so we get into this kind of paradoxical situation, and this is what my earlier work on methodological nationalism tried to show, that we kind of got stuck. On the one hand, we were given this rather reified idea that nation states were the optimal vision of society in modernity. On the other hand, we have this rather flat idea of a global cosmopolitan future with no nations. And there was kind of very little in between. And of course, this is not how things have developed, but even at the time, it didn't feel like kind of a view that will kind of be able to capture the nuances that Weber was already talking about 100 years ago. Another thing that is interesting about the debate on methodological nationalism, and I'm thinking here maybe Dave Eldervass and some of his work on critical realism may find some other debates in which similar things happen, that it's a kind of a debate where no one really supports one of the positions. It's one of the positions. It's kind of a strange debate because no one declares himself or herself explicitly in favor of methodological nationalism. So everyone is critical of methodological nationalism. Everyone puts forward a critique of methodological nationalism, and then someone else comes along and offers a critique of the critique of methodological nationalism. And if you want to abuse the term, no, the critique of the critique of the critique. So it's a kind of, it's turned into a little bit of a vicious circle where we're not quite sure what we stand. And part of the problem, I think, will come in the next sets of slides, is how we understand the relationship between modernism and primordialism within nationalism studies. So the next mark, if you can, please. So this is arguably the kind of foundational debate within nationalism studies. The debate on methodological nationalism is mostly a debate in sociology, in IR, in political science, in anthropology, in migration studies, but it's not a central debate within nationalism studies per se. On the other hand, the debate between primordialism and modernism is indeed the foundational debate of the field that we know as nationalism studies, the ASEN, the Association for the Study of Nationalism, and Ethnic Studies, I think, is the acronym, what the acronym stands for. No, this is what the debate stands for. And to put it very, very briefly, for primordialists or for ethnic symbolists, I think is the kind of more contemporary name. There is the idea that nations are significant because they are somehow as old as history itself. That the prevalence of nations somehow proves that there is some kind of transhistorical link to or with national identities. Whereas in modernism, in a sense, again, similar to Mick's argument a couple of weeks ago, nations only exist because modernity, as a result of modernization processes. So in a way, they are kind of the two opposite poles. And I think is that we need to find some middle ground, perhaps not surprisingly, because if we take the positions as we, in their extremes, I think we're kind of missing, again, some of the nuances that I showed in the first slide. But we'll see that this is, again, easier said than done. So I think it is relatively easy to show that before modernity, the idea of the nation was well in use in everyday life. It was a kind of a clear marker of people's cultural identities. The idea of the nation, say, in Roman times, was very much in vogue in order to point to people's geographical location. It wasn't related to the need of a state. It wasn't at all connected to political autonomy, but it was related to regions of the world. And it was also related to some cultural features that made it easier to identify certain groups. So the idea of the nation related to certain laws, to certain religious practices, to certain foodstuffs, music, handicrafts, a sense of fashion that made a certain group unique or different from other groups. The point I'm trying to make, and it's a point that it is made in the literature, it's not at all an original point, is that the politics is the association of the nation with the state with a political ideology, that is modern. But the association of the idea of the nation with some geographical location and with some cultural marker, it's really not something modern. That doesn't mean that every single nation that we recognize as such today would have been present, I don't know, 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. But it's perfectly plausible to find references to nations in the past with complete autonomy from any development that we would characterize as modern. And what is interesting is that, of course, national identities underwent huge transformations with the rise of modernity, but they change alongside pretty much everything else. That's what the center of any social scientific understanding of modern social life. Everything changed in modernity. This is Marx's argument. Not all that solid melts into air. Everything in modernity changed. Class structures changed. Bureaucratic institutions changed. Mass media system changed. Market changed. International organization changed. So when national identities changed and were transformed and were reshaped, they were always reshaped in conjunction with all these other dimensions. They didn't change on their own. And I think, and perhaps Marco will want to press me on this, I don't think the literature on nationalism has found or has achieved any consensus whatsoever on what are the main, let's put it sort of strongly here, causal factors to say, oh, it really is class structure, or it's really the media system that is the main trigger for the transformation of national identities. We still don't know. We haven't really found that there is one main causal trajectory for the development of national identities. So I think, in a way, we're still, the modernist position is still struggling with this kind of sense of opacity that Weber was struggling with 100 years ago, because in a way we're looking at the wrong, we're looking at the wrong place. What modernism is actually changing, in a sense, is fundamental and trivial at the same time. Nations have transformed, or nations are a major transformation of the modern world, because the modern world itself is a major transformation of all areas of social life. I suppose that's the point I'm trying to make. The next one, Marco, please. So I suppose we need to make the distinction that if nations are not modern, specifically modern, nation states are modern. But if nation state and what's its unique about the modern world, then we need to be careful, because we're kind of pushed back into the core beliefs of methodological nationalisms. Nations have to have their own state. National sovereignty must remain undivided. The nation's strength depends on internal homogeneity. A perfect international organization is one that is neatly divided into formally equivalent of nation states. So the modernist case, which tends to be prevalent in the literature, because primordialism feels transhistorical, it feels to us social scientists, as essentialist. The modernist case has its own problems. So the point I'm trying to make is that we need to reassess continuities and discontinuities in a much more fluid and much more nuanced ways. And the modernist case, it's also prone to reification, in the sense that it allows for all the historical flexibility that you want in the past, before the 18th century, the late 1700s. But then, after the French Revolution, in the case of Latin American countries, for example, after Latin American independence, between 1810 and 1830s, then the nation is fully established, and then nothing changes, because a sense of national identity is fully established from then onwards, and then it doesn't change. And that, from a social scientific point of view, that doesn't make any sense. So I think the debate of primordialism and modernism, because of the way in which the social scientific literature tends to work, it was relatively easy for us to move towards a modernist consensus, as it were, because the primordialist position tends to be, tends to offer transhistorical arguments that are not easy to swallow for us. But the price that we pay for us is a certain reification of the transformation that happened after a certain moment in time. In the case of British history, at the height of Victorian times, and then a certain sense of British national, within inverted quotes, British national identity, gets fixed in time, and then Britishness, let alone Englishness, gets frozen in time because it got established then, and from then on, it kind of doesn't move, it doesn't evolve anymore. And this is not a good approach to the study of nationalism. Okay, the next one, Marco, please. Thank you. The last topic is the politics of nationalism. And I think it's important to remember, I think Mick again made the point very well in his talk, that when he was writing Banal Nationalism in the mid 1990s, when I started working on this topic in the early 2000s, it really felt that nationalism, the politics of nationalism, was purely regressive, was purely conservative. It had nothing to offer kind of for a kind of democratic, progressive outlook. And not only that, historically, it was on the wane, because there was a sense of cosmopolitan European view that all like-minded academics and progressive would have to embrace. So there was a sense that the politics of nationalism offered little challenges in terms of one's sort of academic work. And there was a very good article by Gerard Delante at the time, when he said, look, if you look at the literature on nationalism, the rise of nationalism, the rise of modern nationalism, the politics of nationalism has been connected, as I said, to state bureaucracy, to mass media, to capitalism, to the printing press, you name it. But it never been connected to the question of cosmopolitanism, to its relationship to cosmopolitan ideas. And then at the time, Habermas was also writing on this, and he offers this for a kind of critical theorist and a guy, a Europeanist and a cosmopolitan writer like Habermas. He offers this rather strange kind of argument in which he says that the nation has two faces. Now, there are two sides to the nation. There is the tension between the universalism of the egalitarian legal community and the particularism of a community united by historical destiny. And both are built into the very concept of the national state. Here he's not saying the nation, but the nation state. But the point for me is that I think there is more to say about the politics of nationalism than to say the nation is particularist, is regressive, and cosmopolitan is universalist and is progressive. So in the paper, I tried to look, and this is something I've been doing for a while. I had published a paper in Spanish on this before, but I never kind of looked at it kind of more systematically. What happens is we try and kind of connect questions of universalism, particularism, nationalism, and cosmopolitanism, and see if we can offer a more nuanced understanding of the particularistic side of cosmopolitanism and the universalistic side of nationalism, and to see if there is something we are able to see which otherwise remains hidden. When we see at the different kind of, the different sides or the different dimensions, different normative dimensions of the politics of nationalism. So what I want to do in the next 2 slides, and then I'm getting to the end of the talk, is to look at each of these 4 kind of constellations in turn. So the next slide, please, Marco. So I can't see the title of the first because I have a bar. It's nationalism. Oops.
I think it should be
nationalism and particularism. Yeah. So this is the kind of straightforward nationalistic politics, the one that we see in nationalistic parties, the one that puts the loyalty to the nation at the center. So it's the idea that whatever commitments we may have, whatever sense of loyalty we may develop, whatever threats on whatever future we may have, it all hangs on whether or not the nation is at its center. And in a sense, and I think the past decade, the Brexit debate and politics in so many countries, Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, indeed Brexit again, show that it is not so much that is a sense of nationalism that doesn't allow for any diversity. It's not a sense of nationalism that says, oh, we all have to be British or Brazilian or Chilean or whatever in the same way. Is that whatever differences we may have, they all have to remain subordinated to our national belonging and loyalty. So the core of what a nationalistic politics is, to my mind, is the sense that nationalism, the nation is the one object that gives coherence to social life as a whole, is the one value that cannot be threatened under any circumstances, and is the one that that cannot be challenged. So, for example, in the politics of anti-Semitism, we can have as many Jews as you want, but dual loyalties are not allowed. So, if we think they're more loyal to Jews are more loyal to Israel than to Britain or to Chile, then there is a problem. So I think what's specific about kind of right-wing politics is this sense of not so much the idea of homogeneity per se, but the idea that the diversity is allowed only to the extent that it doesn't challenge the primacy of the nation. Then there is the question of a certain set of when we look at cosmopolitanism from the angle of particularism, the kind of following the same logic. And there is very, very interesting work by Ian Woodward, for example, who is now in Denmark, but also from other colleagues who look at kind of cosmopolitanism from bottom up. Also Vincenzo Cicelli in Paris, who look at questions of cosmopolitanism in the way it develops in schools, in young people, in various communities, and how a sense of cosmopolitanism allows to decenter precisely the idea that the nation is the most important form of social and political identity. The idea that for many of us in this room, and for many of us, when we talk to our students, national belonging, national allegiances are diverse, are multifarious, are complex, and that as soon as we scratch, what's in the surface, we are able to connect and to relate to a variety of identities that this first sense of nationalistic politics doesn't allow to doesn't allow to come up or to flourish or to develop. So there is a sense of openness or diversity or acceptance of difference that doesn't connect cosmopolitanism to an idea of universal human rights, and we'll get to that, but to the idea that diversity lives within us and that we are able to connect to a variety of different groups, to a variety of different identities, and indeed to even to self-reflect on our own traditions, to the extent that we allow these different threads that constitute us more flexible. Okay, let's go a little bit quicker so we leave space for discussion. Then there is the nationalist, the universalist aspect of nationalism. And I think this is something that gets underplayed in the literature of nationalism alone, which is the fact that in anti-colonial movements, but not only in anti-colonial movements, part of the appeal of nationalism is that it appeals to the egalitarian and self-determining values of the Enlightenment. In most nations across the world, there is a moment where the nation is the vehicle. The nation is the way through which citizens see themselves as co-national who are free and equal in their rights and take on their shoulders, takes among themselves the self-determining values of constituting a future in which no one tells them how to lead their lives. The success of the nation, of which Weber is talking about, is, I think, to a large extent, depend on the ability of mobilizing, of the nation's ability to mobilize people's sense of loyalty, not the kind of atavic sense of loyalty of us against them, but also the us in a kind of more democratic and egalitarian and self-determining spirit. And I think because of what's happening in the past 15 years in the world, because of right-wing politics, because of the kind of ugly side of nationalism, we tend to lose sight of huge part of the appeal of nationalism is centrally to do with its democratic character. Again, not only in anti-colonial movements, but also in the present. It's not coincidence, and in protest movements all over the world, the reconfiguration of national values. It's always to do with this kind of idea of self-determination. And finally, I suppose this is the most straightforward, this kind of more universalistic sense of cosmopolitanism, which has to do with universal human rights, and an idea of universal humanity that I don't have time to go into this now, but we can discuss it later if you want. That is not a Western or a modern invention. We can trace it back to what Karl Jasper called the axial age in sort of 300 BC to sort of 400 AC, and it's the idea that some sense of common humanity was a development of all world religions at the time, and the very emergence of an early cosmopolitan imaginary, for example, in early Greek times, was in itself a critique that identity had to be related to a sense of closeness, that the most powerful sense of identity had to relate to questions of us against them. Right, only to finish, just to highlight some final conclusions. Now, nations are modern, but they are not only modern. The roots lie outside modernity, and there is some kind of trans-historical continuities that we need to be able to trace back. I think when I started looking at these debates 20 years ago, when Mick started looking at this debate 30 years ago, people were not talking about the resurgence of extreme form of nationalism was around the corner. But if it now feels that we can only see right-wing nationalism is the only expression of nationalism, we shouldn't be thinking that this is the only way that nationalism will continue to work in the future. I think if the pendulum swings too much in one direction or in the other, part of our role as social scientists is to keep our reflexive and critical minds at work and keep thinking about the backs and forths of nationalism and nationalistic politics, and not to be persuaded in that nationalism it's only progressive or only regressive, only universalistic, and only particularistic. And indeed, just to a little play of words, if a key paradox of the sociology of nationalism, or that sociology of nationalism must be able to grasp, is that all nations believe that they are exceptional. And in looking at their exceptionalism, we may be able to learn something about all nations. Right, I think I'll stop there and we can perhaps open the debate. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Daniel. Thank you very much, Daniel. I really appreciate your contribution. I think it opened up a lot of interesting points, questions as well. I'm sure if there were some scholars, modernist scholar, that would take issue with the when is the nation, because they feel very strongly about when the nations originate, if you take a modernist perspective. But I do appreciate your take of paying more attention to the evolution of the nation in time rather than fixing the nation in time, emphasizing the origins. I'm opening the floor now for any questions or comments you might have. If you want, you can also open the camera while you're asking the question, or if you want, you can just put the question in the chat, as you prefer. I see, I think Heike first, and then Dave, and then Tom. Heike, do you want to collect 3 questions, and then we see? Okay, Heike.
Hello. Hi, Daniel. Good to see you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. My research on the historical geographies of the universities have led me to Germany, of all places. And what I absolutely do not understand, and I would be interested in your opinion as a scholar who has written a lot on nationalism, how was it possible that in the German Reich after 1871, anti-Semitism was so predominant, and that nevertheless Jewish, German people were in fervent nationalists who voluntarily fought for the German Reich for the German Empire in the First World War, and I'm sure they would have in the Second as well if the Holocaust hadn't happened. So I mean, you know, this extreme mind-boggling experience of people, you know, who were either married to Jewish people who were in danger, who were Jewish themselves, and were so behind the German nation. How can we explain this power of nationalism to unite different people, even if at the same time those who propagate nationalism were heavily anti-Semitic?
Daniel, is it okay if I take more questions? Because I'm conscious of the time. Is it okay? Dave, do you want to go? Dave? Dave, maybe you're
sorry,
muted.
thanks.
Dave?
Sorry, just took me a moment to work out how to turn myself back on there. Hi, Daniel. Great to see you again after a few years, and a fascinating talk, by the way. Thank you. My question was really about the fact that national loyalties seem to sometimes be kind of layered, not just in the sense that someone might have allegiances to, I don't know, England and Chile, but but led internally, and the UK is the classic example of that, but I'm sure there are lots of others around the world, like Spain, for example, where many British people also think of themselves as English or Scottish or Welsh or Cornish. I see Tom is here. How does that fit with your idea of the nationalism as a kind of demand for someone's prime loyalty to be to the nation, when actually many people are parts of multiple kind of nested nations? That's my question.
Dan, you want to take, there are still two questions. You want to take the two? You want just one? You want the two? Okay. Yeah, Tom. Tom?
Yes, yeah, can do. Thanks, Daniel, for a great talk and your characteristic intellectual precision, but also your passion as well. And nationalism is something I studied as an undergraduate and have flirted with on and off in my postgraduate and working career. But it's lovely to sort of rekindle some of this via your enthusiasm. I just had it fired a few thoughts. I'm going to quickly get in with two thoughts or questions. And one of them is that a dynamic in the current resurgence of nationalism seems to be almost setting against a kind of reflexive or critical nationalism, where particularly, I'm talking about the context of Britishness, where people want, one camp wants an honest appraisal and a critical reflection on the history of the British Empire in particular, but Britain as a nation, good and bad. And then the kind of measure of nationalism, which is about performative often and loyalty, basically. And I think there's an undercurrent there of different visions of nationalism, whether it demands unquestioning loyalty, which gives the nation this power and agency over us as individuals. You can't question anything. If you do, you're a traitor or should leave. Which seems to underpin quite a lot of conflict and debates about the nation at the moment. The other thought that occurred to me is when intersectionality, which has a far longer intellectual history than a lot of pop media debates indicate at the moment. But I kind of think something that's interesting about intersectionality, it's race and gender was Crenshaw's original formulation of the concept. And it tends to go race, gender, class, age, disability, sexuality. Nation or national belonging very rarely features in that kind of, list of possible identifiers which supposedly intersect with each other. Do you have any sense of why that might be? Because purely anecdotally, in my own PhD research on stag tourism, I was writing about masculinity. And in a few cases, I did my fieldwork in Poland, right? So in a few cases, I was thinking, well, there's a visible contrast between a kind of British masculinity and a Polish masculinity. And I thought that was an interesting intersection, but your talk just struck me that national identity is very rarely mentioned as one of these important intersections.
Daniel, we have the last question. You want to take the last question? You want to go with the three?
Okay.
Eric.
Okay. Good. Well, I very much liked your talk, and especially the distinction you make between nations and nation states, and also your plea for a historical approach, which as a historian I very much like, obviously. But I would also like to defend the modernist perspective. I agree with you that in the early modern and even medieval times there were ideas about nations and national identities. But I think the age of revolutions really was a sharp break in a sense. So in France, what they wanted when they created the nation state was a sharp break with the past. They want to get rid of all this folkloric rubbish. And France rapidly expanded and included Germans, Belgians, people from the Netherlands and Italians into the French nation state as full citizens. So the movement to reappreciate these supposedly national traditions only happens during the Romantic era. So it is a kind of, well, invention of tradition, which happens only at the start of the 19th century. Well, at least that's my perspective. And nations were very fluid at the time as well. So Cartagena de Indias was defined as a nation. The city of Mainz defined itself as a nation. So the entire conception of the nation was very fluid at the time. So.
Thank you, Eric. Daniel, basically you have two historical questions, maybe it can be related, and then two more sociological ones, so up to you.
Well, fantastic questions. What a nice bunch of colleagues I used to have at Loughborough Plaza, our friend from Leiden, so thank you very much. I mean, Heike, what can I say? That is one of the $1 million questions if you are interested in this topic. Let me say two things. From the standpoint of German Jews at the time, I think they had their own internal struggles. So I think part of the question is what kind of process, as agents, what were they after at the time? Some wanted to remain Jewish in a traditional sense. So they wanted to remain religious and, dress in traditional clothes, and they wanted to do nothing with modernity. Some were Zionists already, wanted to do nothing with Germany and wanted to go to Palestine. Some wanted to assimilate fully. Some wanted a kind of a more kind of reformist approach. So I suppose one first answer is there was Jewish communities were extremely diverse and were very divided on what was the reaction to these transformations. And families were broken. There is a beautiful book on the history of the Scholem family. The Scholem, the scholar, but also the politician. And that's the period. And the families were broken, were divided. They couldn't talk to each other because some were Zionists, some were Marxists, some were traditionalists. So they couldn't see eye to eye. So I think from the Jewish side, I think there were very different reactions to this. From the standpoint of the mainstream nation, if I can put it like that, I think it's the promise of universal integration. It's part of what I'm trying to suggest in the talk. This is the appeal of the nation. We may want to discuss if it's a flawed appeal, if it's ideology, or okay, that's we don't have the time now. We can do it later. But you see but that's the appeal. If you come to us, the doors to heaven are open to you. If you if you enter into this contract, you become one of us.
Yeah.
But I think you need both. I think it's very important not to lose sight the fact that the Jewish communities were deeply divided.
Yeah.
Deeply
and so were those who considered themselves as German and were Protestant or Catholic. Yeah. This is, that is very helpful. This hope for universal integration. But I have been very surprised to come across many Jewish professors who were very, very conservative, so that the conservatism resonated with the nationalism in the German Empire, despite the flourishing anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's very insightful.
Think of Hermann Cohen.
Yeah.
But Hermann Cohen was hated within some Jewish quarters because he was, you're surrendering our Jewish identity to the project of German enlightenment. Who do you think you are?
No.
But he didn't think he was doing that. So, okay, we could really go on. I feel passionate about this, but okay.
Yeah, sorry, for the people that are more, no, 1 second. For people that, Daniel, for people that are more knowledgeable than me about technology, I saw a message. They say basically at 3 o'clock the meeting is over, but I'm expecting Teams will allow to go over the 3 p.m.
Okay.
So apologies, the line collapses, but I'm expecting that we can continue. Please let me know if you know better than me. You can put it in the chat. I saw, sorry, John, 1 second. So I saw Iris, whether she, Iris, do you have a quick question again? Because I'm expecting it might be related to what Heike said. If you have it, can you have it now, the question? So.
It's a follow-on comment, but I would like Daniel to be able to answer the other questions because they were first. So if there's time at the end, it's just like a quick question, but following later.
Thank you.
Okay, on Dave's question, I think the British case with all its layers is particularly complicated, not uniquely, but particularly complicated. I think this is partly also related to, I suppose, to Tom's, is the fact that is where, I mean, is where it's not really my, my theoretical language. You know me well enough for this, but it's where do you, where if you invest your emotional or symbolic resources as an agent, where your investment gets more return from. Where if you invest them on being Cornish, or you invest them on being British, or you invest them on being Scottish, you will get different returns from your investments. And this changes over time. So I suppose for countries, and here we have Iris and we have Heike, in countries where strong federal structures, your investment on the federal state as opposed to the local state, may be different. So I suppose the question of layers is really an empirical question. In countries with strong federal structures, it may make more sense to declare yourself, more, to engage more directly with an identity which is not your national identity. In a country like Chile, to invest in your regional identity gives you very, very little return because this is a very centralized country. So I suppose my question would be that the answer would be empirical more than theoretical, and it has to do with the kind of bureaucratic organization of the state and how groups, peoples, communities, and social movements learn to handle all these different things. Tom, in relation to empire, I don't have a lot to say other than that I don't like the kind of, let's call it, put it this way, it's kind of methodological imperialism. So now everything to do with British identity is to do with empire. I'm not saying empire is not important, far from it, but I don't think we're gaining a lot if we move from methodological nationalism to methodological imperialism. And why is it that intersectionality doesn't figure? I think it's a very, very, very good point. The answer is I don't know. I suppose my hunch, but it's only a hunch, is that because on the whole nationalism is seen from the standpoint of the majority. So nationalism would have to figure, from an intersectionality standpoint as the nationality of the minority. So, for example, in the American case, the US case, it'll come from the standpoint of race. In Latin America, funnily enough, it does figure, because it figures from the standpoint of the ethnic identity of Aboriginal groups, similar to New Zealand or to Australia. So my hunch, but again, I'm not really sure. I'm improvising a bit. I suppose it comes from highlighting. I'll start again. If intersectionality tends to highlight a certain identity that is either a minority or a group that is discriminated against, the idea of national identity tends to focus on the majority, then you would need to include it in terms of a particular group that is being discriminated against or an ethnic minority within the nation. And the last question, of course, I'm not arguing that that there isn't a significant change with the age of revolution. But I'm not arguing that, you know, in the classical study of Eugene Weber, and all that, you know, from peasants into Frenchmen or French citizens, that there was this movement. All I'm trying to say that there was a sense, for example, and this is, you know, well studied, that slaves, and Iris is here, slaves who they were transferred from Africa to the Americas. They travel with their own sense of identity, of cultural identity, that in a strong sense, it is something we can call a national identity. In what sense is different? It didn't have politics. It wasn't attached to citizenship. It wasn't attached to a sense of statehood. But in the sense of being a cultural marker, as I pointed out, in the sense of a particular dress code, a particular type of food, particular religious practices, a particular religious practices, a particular sense of geographical location. What modernity brings along, and I think you put it quite rightly, you know, the idea that nations are citizens of the state, that is surely modern. I wouldn't argue with that at all. What I would contend is that sense of nations being cultural marker, that's before modernity. And I think you're spot on. What is a nation? Of course, was flexible. So there is no, I think Mick makes this point extremely well in his book. You know, there was no certainty, there was no necessity, there was no teleology that certain nations would have had to evolve in the way that they did. So we could have had a different set of nation states all over the world. On that, I'm not perfectly on board with the modernist position.
Thank you, Daniel. A very last question from Iris then.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Daniel. A great talk and lots of food for thought here. I like that you started with Weber and Weber's argument that a nation is very much a sentiment of a group of people, you know, facing other groups of people. It actually, I think we could connect this with Anderson's idea of the nation as an imagined community. I think that I could see that working. And I want to also sort of continue on the intersectionality idea. I think, you know, historical studies have shown that discourses of nation and race were interlinked in European societies. And I have shown this in two of my case studies on anti-Muslim racism and anti-Black racism in German society. So while I think on the one hand, it makes sense to look at these continuities, and we can see now in contemporary society that nationalism and the search of nationalism is clearly linked with racist agendas and anti-immigrant agendas. At the same time, I think we need to address the dynamics of nationalism, if that makes sense, and see, you know, how it is a fluid concept in a way that it seems to reinvent itself. And I wonder what you think about it, because I remember when Ulrich Beck argued, you know, cosmopolitanism is the future and the European Union is the future, and he died before Brexit happened. But I sometimes wonder whether, you know, we actually, as social scientists now, ought to make an effort to explain what is happening in Europe and wider in Western society with nationalism in a populist version linked to racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, researching and really very strongly causing us trouble.
No, you're spot on, Iris. I always, when I used to teach Beck at Loughborough, I used to say, yes, Beck, all cosmopolitan Europe, you know, here, there, and everywhere, but there was nothing on refugees in his work at all.
Yeah.
It's not in the index of the book. It has nothing to say about refugees in a cosmopolitan Europe. So the question, the ways in which nationalism reconfigures itself on its exclusionary side. I think that's a dynamic that we need to be constantly re-engaging and re-exploring. I suppose my argument is that we should always be looking at both sides, as it were. How is it that nationalism is able to reinvent itself, both in terms of its idea of self-determination, because it always uses that card, and it always gives people the sense that we are the owners of our future, which is one of the promises of democracy. And at the same time, as it makes that promise, going back to Heike's question, then it makes that promise, and to a large extent it delivers on that promise. Then in delivering on that promise, it makes all these other exclusions. And it creates new exclusions. I don't know, you of course you know so much better than I do. In the German case, all the Turkish workers and the different dimensions and the different arguments. But I think it's how we see the evolution of both sides is what I find interesting.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks very much, Daniel.
We missed Iris.
Thank you, Iris. And thank you very much, Daniel. You see that at the end, I suspect English worked well, so no worries from the beginning. I think it was very clear. Thank you also to all colleagues for their question. It was a very lively session, so thank you very much. Thank you all, and I hope to see you in the next LUNN talks. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Daniel. It's great to see you.
Very good to see you guys.